Hi, everybody. It's Brenda, and this is OTD 502, Applied Occupational Theory. And today we are looking at cognitive rehabilitative frames of reference. Basically, ways to get people better after they've had something happen to them that impairs their cognition. So do not confuse this with cognitive behavioral frame of reference, which is a completely different approach looking at how to get people better when they have some sort of behavioral issue that's impeding their performance. We have some overview of cognitive rehabilitation frames, and these are some videos that you can watch to learn a little bit more about the overview, the broad view of cognitive rehab frames. This is, again, a class of frames of reference. There are many different approaches to getting people better after a cognitive impairment, and we're only going to talk about two of those today, but you'll see some examples in practice with these videos. First of all, we need to define what are we talking about when we talk about cognition. These are the processes by which we take in sensory input, we manage it in our brain, we process it in some way, we store it, we encode it, we associate it with previous memories, and then we use it and bring that back out to the world again. And so this is our ability to acquire and use the information that we need in order to do activity demands. That's Toglia's definition. And she says that this includes information processing, our ability to learn, and our ability to generalize that information to other aspects of our lives. Now, Alan, that we're going to be talking about in our second segment, is cognitive disability. It's a cognitive disability frame, and she focuses more on when people are incapable of doing the activities that they need to do. So this is a global incapacity to do universal human activities. And that's where her frame of reference focuses. But let's first talk about cognitive conditions in general and who these cognitive rehabilitative frames are focused toward. This includes people with traumatic brain injuries, so people who have had something happen traumatically to their brain. These can be acquired brain injuries where there's no trauma involved, but yet people have issues with cognition, such as when people have had encephalopathy or anoxia. This can also include chronic conditions such as psychiatric conditions, dementia, other progressive neurological conditions, or developmental conditions. And another way that people can acquire cognitive conditions would be through CVA, or otherwise acute onsets. Now, to help us talk about cognitive functions, we divide them into basic and higher order. This is sort of an unfair or artificial division because you basically have to have the lower level functioning abilities before you can do the higher level functioning ones, but they're so well integrated when it comes to the way we perform in daily life that you really can't separate them out like this. This just gives us some language of how to talk about these functions. So take note, these would be great options for using in documentation when you talk about cognition. So we talk about orientation, that's our ability to know person, place, and time. Attention, our ability to pay attention to something long enough in order to orient ourselves to it. Our ability to concentrate, which is holding our attention for longer periods of time. Then comes memory, which means being able to commit something to especially short-term or long-term memory, but to take in that information and do something with it. So the interesting thing about memory is that you can't have memory unless you have attention and concentration. You've got to be able to focus on something before you can remember it, which is one of the reasons why we think little babies don't remember things, because they don't have the attention yet to do so. And then we have perceptions, or just sort of knowing where we are in space, being able to make that map of the world. That's actually part of our cognitive functioning as well. The ability to pay visual attention to the things that we need to attend to scan the environment and pick out the important things, and to be able to categorize and sequence. These are all considered basic cognitive functions. Now, higher level cognitive processes include self-awareness, the ability to think about yourself in relatively objective terms. This also includes executive functions, the ability to be intentional and purposeful, to plan, to strategize, to pursue goals, to do problem solving, to monitor our own progress and adjust behavior in accordance with what we're noting about ourselves. Also metacognition, our ability to think about our thinking and to evaluate our own thinking processes. Those are all higher level cognitive processes. So we first have to think about, in terms of cognition, the structure and function of the brain. So with the brain's structural capacity is finite, so it has to make efficient use of the structural capacity that it has. So our brain will do that. Now, even though it's a finite amount, it's a pretty big finite amount. You've heard people say that we don't use all of our brain's capacity, and that is true, but it is still a limited capacity. And when someone has an injury, it's limited even more. So how do we as OTs assess cognition? We assess not the brain's processes itself, but the functional and occupational consequences of the impaired cognition. Now, this is where people can sometimes get into turf wars with occupational therapy as to whether or not OTs ought to be doing something in a particular area of cognitive function. But the line that I have always used when I talk about cognition with people is that we're sort of where the cognition meets the function aspect. If someone cannot functionally manage, say, a kitchen task, or how to sequence their morning routine, or how to problem solve if they have an emergency at home, these are all things that an occupational therapist need to be able to help a person to do. And whereas someone might be able to do a pencil paper activity, when it comes to those higher order problem solving sorts of things, it might be a little different when they carry it out in real life, which is what occupational therapy is all about for these folks. We break it down and look at the cognitive components. And according to Toglia, we do this in a dynamical assessment. Look how much like an occupation-based model this looks. Person, task, and environment. So this is a systems approach. Sounds rather familiar, I hope. It could, sound a little bit like Kielhofner. It could sound a little bit like occupational adaptation. But why does it become then a frame of reference here? Why do we refer to Joan Toglia's dynamic interactional theory as a frame of reference? Think about that for just a moment. What would your answer be? Because it is a practice guideline for a specific domain. Now, what is that specific domain? It's people with cognitive impairments. So even though she's taking an occupation-based approach, she's applying it to a specific domain in this case. And so that makes it a frame of reference. So she says we have to look at the dynamic interaction between the person, the task, and the environment. We can't just look at the person's cognition when they're doing a pencil paper activity. We've got to look at them in context of their dynamic everyday activities that are relevant to the person's life. And then we can look at how much impairment they have or how much function they have and determine what it is that we're going to do about it. So then for treatment, there are 3 approaches that we can use for treatment. We can remediate, meaning restore skills and improve strategies and self-awareness. And the thinking is with especially the dynamic interactional approach that we can remediate, that people can get better. We can compensate. This would say that a person is not going to get better, that they have what cognitive abilities that they're going to have. So then we can modify the external factors. We can change the task, we can change the environment. And this is more of a functional cognitive approach. This is more like a Claudia Allen type of approach, the cognitive disabilities approach. And then the adaptive approach is really very applicable to either of these 2 frames of reference that we're talking about today. We can work with the person and the environment to find the just right challenge. We're going to match the functional cognitive capacities of the individual with the activities, demands, and context. Now, what would that look like? What that might look like is a person, let's say, that is having difficulty cooking the fancy meals that they used to cook using the stove. So maybe we're going to adapt and have them use a toaster oven and a microwave, because that works within their functional cognitive capacities. And we're going to change the task a little bit by maybe starting with partially pre-prepared foods, maybe by writing out the sequence of instructions for them. And that is what we would do for them. Now, Toglia, again, uses this dynamic systems theory. So she's using an approach that we've learned about through Model of Human Occupation and Kiel-Hofner, but applying it to folks with cognitive problems. And she says that these symptoms and their performance is going to change with interaction. It's not going to change in any other way, except that they have to start interacting with the environment that's intended for them to work in. So we have to look at the person factors in that environment. We have to look at the activity demands and the environmental demands, and we have to put all those things together to create a comprehensive approach. If we just try to focus on, oh, this person has memory issues, and work on the memory alone without putting it in a context, it's not going to work for them. That's what this theory says. So in the assessment, it's a very dynamic assessment. We sort of start with assessment and intervention all at once. So we're going to start with having them do a task, and then as they do that task, we're going to work with, hey, if I give them this cue, or hey, if I give them this physical object to change this task, or hey, if I unplug the stove so that they can't turn the stove on, can they be more functional in this particular environment? In this way, treatment has multiple intervention approaches. We're looking at what can we change in the person, how can we fix the environment, and how can we adapt the task in order, again, to put those three things together. And we're doing all those things at once within the Toglia's dynamic interactional approach. That's the dynamic nature. That's the name, where the name dynamic comes in. Of course, I have to fangirl just a little bit. I got to meet Joan Toglia at conference. I believe this was 2017 in Philadelphia. She was very sweet. Let me take her picture. So that's my fangirl for today. Toglia thinks that we have to have a functional approach. Once again, if we do pencil paper, that's not necessarily bad in some context, but we're focusing on what works for the specific goal-directed activities that the person has. And then we take that and we do transfer of learning or generalization, okay? So for example, if a person is doing one activity, we can't just automatically assume that just because they can brush their teeth in sequence that they can also take their shower in sequence. We need to directly address how they're going to generalize what they learned with one activity to the next. Toglia also believes that multi-context training is important. So this kind of takes our bottom-up approach, specific deficits that the person has, and the top-down approach, the specific tasks that the person wants to do, and it makes them meet in the middle. So that's that multi-context. We're looking at person, environment, occupation, but we're also looking at bottom-up, specific deficits, and top-down, specific tasks. So multi-context, functional approach, those are two terms that you're going to need to know. So some basic assumptions from neuroscience is brain plasticity. I won't spend too much time on that because hopefully by now you know what brain plasticity is. Information processing, which includes three aspects. The first has to register the stimulus and perceive that it's there. Then they have to interpret and organize it, kind of file it in their brain. And then they form a hypothesis. They're comparing this to previous memories, and they're going to relate it to a purpose or a goal. So this processing, what happens in the middle is important in terms of that information going in, the activity coming out. And Toglia says that cognition is a system, and therefore we can't just look at sub-processes. We have to look at all the pieces of the system together. And these, of course, are the three systems, the subsystems in the human system: person, activity, and environment. So Toglia is very occupation-based in her approach. I have some videos for you to watch for application in regard to Jonathan Duncan. So you're going to watch these videos about the accident that he experienced and the resulting functional changes. It's his father telling the story. Here are the different aspects that we can break down Jonathan into. So basically, this is an analysis. You could call it an activity analysis of some of the aspects that Jonathan is having trouble with according to the story that his father is telling. What are some of the person aspects that the dad talks about? What are some of the activity problems that he's having? And what are some of the environmental aspects? Now, there's some terms involved in here, some terms in particular that I want you to look up and know what they are. One of them is online awareness, that's in the person aspect. Then we have the activity aspect. Take a look at transfer of learning. Read that from the textbook. And then environment, the zone of proximal development. Look at that one as well. I'm not going to read you those terms. I want you to look those up for yourselves. And I'll be giving you a discussion assignment here in just a little bit. So hang on to that thought for a moment. Toglia has some ideas on function and disability, and this includes the ability to select, to anticipate, to access, and to generalize. I won't talk about that anymore. I'll let you read through those. But those are some of the categories of function and disability that Toglia identifies. Change and motivation. Change is determined, motivation determined by self-awareness. So if a person is aware of their own ability or inability, then they will be motivated to change in appropriate ways. So sometimes part of our job is to help the person become more self-aware in a very gentle and controlled way. Then she talks about processing strategies as well. If a person has these processing strategies, then they're going to be able to make the changes that they need to make. If they don't, we're going to have to help them build those strategies. So here's some more videos about Jonathan, talking about some of the accommodations that he made and the recovery that he made. We are going to use the forum, and I'm going to divide these into our lab groups. And I want everybody to make at least 2 comments, either including both an initial response and a response to your classmates, in discussing how would the dynamic interactional model view function, dysfunction, change, and motivation for Jonathan. So take those terms that we've talked about on the previous slides and apply them to Jonathan. So for Jonathan, function looks like this. The dysfunction he's having looks like this. What are some of the Toglia terms that you would use for that? And could you identify an intervention strategy or 2 for Jonathan and maybe build on each other's discussion of those items? So I will be putting that in the forum. This is the only place I'm talking about it. There will be points for it. It's going to go toward lab grade points, so it'll just kind of add to what's available in the lab grade. But you must complete this forum post by the same date as the lab is due in order for it to be counted for you. So there's where you're going to put that. And you just write it out in the forum. You don't have to make a document or anything. So what do we do for evaluation with Toglia? Well, there are a couple different evaluations that she uses. One is called the category assessment. This one's kind of fun. It uses plastic utensils, and people have to you just give them a little pile of utensils, and you can say, okay, sort them in one way. And maybe they'll sort them by color, sort them in another way. Maybe they'll put all the knives together, all the forks together, all the spoons together. And then there are big and little. So then you say sort them a third way, and maybe they'll sort them by big and little. Maybe they'll sort them in 2 sets. But they should be able to sort them 3 different ways to demonstrate their cognitive abilities. Another is the contextual memory test, and this test basically involves using a tray of objects that you uncover and then cover it up and have the person say as many items as they can remember from the items that you showed them. So those are 2 assessments available through Toglia, and maybe you did those in process classes, maybe not. So intervention, how do we intervene? We've actually talked about it a little bit already. We're going to look at those 3 aspects: person, activity, and environment, and we're going to look at how we're going to put those things together. We create a strategy for the person that the person works with us to come up with. If the person comes up with it, they're so much more likely to be able to follow through with it. So we try to work with the person to create that strategy. Then we practice the task that we have, and then we're going to try to transfer that task. from near to far. So for example, if our near transfer task, our first goal is to sort utensils, maybe our intermediate would be to sort and put away the dishes. A far transfer could be sorting tiles for an unfamiliar craft, and very far could be folding laundry or matching socks. Now, that is actually Toglia's example. Personally, if it were me, I would flip the far and very far. I think that folding laundry and matching socks is a whole lot more like putting away the dishes than sorting tiles for an unfamiliar craft. But I think it all depends on who's doing it, you know, if laundry is a familiar task to that person or not. Another intervention strategy can be using a memory notebook, and this is a Toglia intervention task that's been used quite a bit. People can use an actual physical notebook. They can use the notes on their phone, and just being able to organize that notebook is a goal in itself. And another thing that Toglia uses is group interventions to practice certain strategies. So she has folks get together and they can learn from each other in order to create and practice the strategies for different activities. So that's all for Toglia. Please join me in the next segment for Claudia Allen.